Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create a construction tools card. Now, this is part of an April Fool's thing that my husband and I were doing. He made a joke one time about him doing a voiceover for one of my videos. So I said, yeah, I'll let you do a voiceover. And so we've been trying to figure out for a while what we would wanted to do. We decided that doing it as an April Fool's thing might be kind of fun. Now, my husband is in construction, so I thought this construction tools, this is called All the Tools Die set, would be the perfect one to use for this card. If you'd like to hear or watch the video where my husband does the voiceover, you will find it in it's the video posted right before this one. The first thing I did was use some nice thick cardstock. This is the cardstock that I like to use for my card bases. I created one card base for it. It's A2 size, so it's 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. Obviously scored down the middle. It was cut at 8.5 by 5.5 inches and then scored down the middle to create the A2 base. I'm using these dies on a quarter sheet of this thick cardstock to create kind of a stencil. I wanted to use some texture paste to create a dimensional tool. I didn't want to use cardstock. I've done a card with these tools before. I will link that video at the end of this one. So I wanted to do a different technique than I did for that video. So I thought by using these tools to create a little bit of a stencil would be a fun and different way to use them. So I'm placing them on this quarter sheet of cardstock and taping them in place. I want to make sure that the dies stay in place while I'm die cutting, just at the off chance that I have to die cut them again. In the end, I don't have to do this. I'm doing this with a quarter sheet, and then I have another piece of this same cardstock that I'm going to do that stenciling on with that texture paste. Now, I'm using nice and thick cardstock because I want to give that texture paste a little bit of extra dimension. However, keep in mind that with texture paste and cardstock, it's not going to be a stencil that can be used over and over again. It's pretty much a one-time use thing, and once I'm done with this, I take this stencil off and I do toss it away. So this is just a one-time thing. Cardstock doesn't really hold up to using as a stencil when it comes to texture paste. I could use it with like an ink pad and a stencil brush a few times, but texture paste, not so much. So I have some transparent gloss texture paste here, and I'm using some Pewter Perfect Pearls, using some offset spatula, one of my paste tools, to mix in that Perfect Pearls. And I keep mixing it in to make sure it's not gritty, to make sure all of that color is in there. Once I have it mixed as much as I want, I'm going to put a little glob of each one of them right above the openings for this tool. Now, this tool set comes with that one that I used to mix the paste, but it also comes with this nice large one, which is perfect for getting that paste over that whole surface. And I do it a few times until I have that paste completely filling those open areas. Then I'm going to set that piece over aside to dry, clean off my surface. And the piece that I used for my stencil, I just tossed that away right away. For the background for this card, I wanted to use this bark embossing folder. This is from a previous Simon Hurley collection, and I just love the wood grain that it gives. I thought it would be fun to give that wood grain a little bit of extra texture. So I'm using a Gathered Twigs distress pad, and I'm inking the side of the embossing folder that I don't have my paper on. I did tape my paper in place so that I can do this a couple times and build that ink up. And by taping it in place, I don't have to make sure that that paper doesn't shift. I know it's going to stay in place and it's not going to shift on me. Often when I ink embossing folders, I typically will do them 3 times if I want like a solid background, because this is just putting some of that color into the recessed areas of that embossed background. I don't really need to worry about that. I end up doing this 2 times. It had enough ink for me. I wanted just to see some darker areas and some lighter areas, kind of like you'd see with wood. Another option after this step would be to use an ink blending brush and add a little bit of ink blending to it, but I didn't find that I thought it was necessary. I'm using some Peridot cardstock to use with the other parts of the dies for these tools. Now, these tool die sets have different pieces to them and they layer together, which gives them some nice visual dimension. My husband's favorite color is fluorescent green. This is the closest cardstock that I have to the fluorescent green, so I decided to use that one. Once I have that set aside, and I'm doing this all while I'm waiting for that paste to dry, it does take a while for that paste to dry, and you don't want to continue on with that particular piece until it is fully dry. But we might as well utilize this time and put some of the pieces or elements together. So For my sentiment for this, I'm using the Ideal Moment Sentiment press plate and die set. This one has a sentiment on it that says Happy Father's Day. You could also use this for Happy Birthday. Pretty much any sentiment that worked for a male would work. I mean, or a female. If you have someone in your family that is female that does home improvement or construction, this would work for them as well, and you can customize the colors for it. I chose to do this as a Happy Father's Day card. Obviously, I'm not giving it to him for Father's Day because he's done the voiceover. He's going to be able to see it. But I just thought it would be fun to do one that had a theme that was kind of up his alley. So once my texture paste background is completely dried, I'm using my guillotine trimmer to trim it down. So this image piece, I end up trimming down to 3¼ inches by 4½ inches. Then I'm going to do a silver mat around it, and I chose some matte silver cardstock from the Silver Treasured cardstock pack, and I'm trimming that to 3 3/8 inches by 4 5/8 inches. So it just has a really thin border around it. Again, I didn't want to cover up too much of this wood embossed background. For that embossed background, I trimmed that to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. And then I took another quarter sheet of that Peridot cardstock and I trimmed that to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. So that bark has a border around it that's the same size as the silver border around my tool piece. And I just thought it was a great way to incorporate this bright green in another area other than the tops of the tools. So I can glue those pieces to my card base. I'm using some Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle. This means that I can use this not only for these layers, but I can also use it to add the extra die cut layers to those tools on the front of the card. So while letting those pieces dry, I decided I wanted to do a little bit of ink blending on this background. So I'm using that same Gathered Twigs Distress pad that I used to ink the embossing folder. And I'm just doing a little bit of light ink blending around the outside edge. I'm not trying to cover the entire piece. I want to have just kind of a bit of a frame. It's going to tie that brown together. And I'm also going to use that same ink pad to ink around those die cut pieces for the handles for the tools. So I put this layer down and then I start adding the layers for the handles of the tools. So I use my ink pad and just go right around the outside edges. You could also use an ink blending brush, but I was afraid because some of these pieces are fairly tiny, I was afraid of completely covering them. I didn't want to turn them like a brown green. I wanted to still see that bright color, but I still wanted to incorporate that brown. So by just putting it around the edges, it gives that color, it ties it all in, but it doesn't completely cover up that green. And I'm using that same Barely Art glue and that fine tip bottle to glue this all in place. Now, this is at the point where I realized that I had missed a piece for my saw. I went to go put this handle on and realized that it didn't fit right. And then looked at my die set and realized that I had missed a piece. So I took some of the Portobello cardstock. This is the same cardstock that I used for that bark embossed background and cut the piece that I was missing. Then put that on my sticky mat in order to ink blend around it. Again, tying in that ink blending and that brown color, and then glued that on the handle of the saw. And you can see right on my background there, I accidentally got ink on my fingers and got a fingerprint on here. Now I will fix it by strategically placing my sentiment on top of it. I was going to use the sand eraser to erase it, but I had let that ink sit for too long, so it kind of seeped into the paper, and that sand eraser really didn't do anything. If it had just been done, it probably would have been a lot more effective. I had planned to put my sentiment on the center part in the middle of the card. I just decided to get a little bit creative and put it up a little bit higher, and it covered that fingerprint smudge, so it's not nearly as noticeable. I took one of the sentiments in those sentiments that I had die cut that I had figured I wasn't going to be using and put that on the back of my sentiment just to give it a little bit of extra oomph and dimension. I could also have taken some scrap cardstock and used that die to die cut that piece, or just use my trimmer to trim just a narrow strip, but this just worked perfectly. Here is the finished card. You can see that this was a really quick one to come together. The thing that took the longest was coming up with the idea and then waiting for that paste to dry, but a great one for a handyman or someone in construction that you love, that you wanted to give a card to. Thank you so much for joining me. If you haven't already checked out the video that my husband did the voiceover for, you might want to check it out. before he did it, I was excited and curious to see what he would say, to see how much he'd be paying attention to the things that I like to do. And it was just a fun project. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a fantastic day.